This happened when I was working part-time at a ramen restaurant. I first got the job when I was around 16 years old during the early years as a high school student. This happened in my hometown, Kota, in Shiga Prefecture. The ramen restaurant I worked in was inside a shopping department, and I worked nearly every weekend after school serving customers and operating the register. I would start at about 7 and work right up to midnight some nights, cleaning and closing down usually. Opposite the register, there was a row of seats for anyone in the mall to use who needed to have a break. They were used by everyone, not just customers of our restaurant. My experience happened about a year and a half into working there, making me 17 years old at the time. Also, I'm female, by the way. One day during a lull in my shift, my manager and coworker approached me and asked, "Hey Erica, do you have any older friends around here?" I was kind of confused by that question, but quickly responded with a no because I didn't want to be asked strange questions like that. Both my manager and coworker shook their heads in what seemed like disagreement or surprise. I wasn't sure which, and then my manager said, "I see." I had no idea why they had asked me that, and I didn't know what they were talking about. I went back to work and shrugged it off, and a few weeks later, my coworker came up to me and asked, "Hey Erica, can you please go to the bathroom and come back?" It felt odd, but I stood there confused until the manager came over. When I asked them why they wanted me to do this, neither gave me a proper answer, and the manager just replied, "It's fine, it's just an experiment. Can you just go back and forth quickly?" I did what they asked, going to the bathroom and coming back. I didn't understand the point of the so-called experiment, though. After spending a few seconds in the bathroom, I returned to see concerned looks on both of their faces. My manager then frowned and said, "I think you might be being followed by an older man." At first, I didn't understand what they meant. I guess because I was young and a bit naive, I couldn't process why an older man would be following me, so I asked them. They both subtly glanced towards a row of seats, and I looked in that direction and saw an older man sitting there looking our way. As soon as he noticed me looking back at him, he turned his head. I had no idea who he was, but I felt pretty creeped out. Clearly, he had been watching us. I asked my coworkers why they thought that he was following me. I mean, sitting outside the store, is that really being followed? I wasn't sure, so I let them explain. "Well, every time you're on shift, that guy sits right over there and stares at you. When you leave the store or go to the restroom, he gets up too and starts following you. It seems like he's stalking you." And it terrified me, but not in the way that a ghost story would. As they say, people are scarier than ghosts. I glanced at him again, wanting to make sure that I didn't know him, and as I studied his face, I became certain that he was a complete stranger to me, and that realization left me feeling weird inside, a mix of disgust and numbness. After learning that he had been watching me, I couldn't get it out of my mind for the rest of my shift. I spent the time either looking over my shoulder or stealing casual glances at him, trying to avoid eye contact though. When my shift ended that night, my coworkers walked part of the way home with me, which I appreciated. But later, when I was alone, I looked over my shoulder and saw that same creepy middle-aged man following me at a distance. And that's when I realized I was being stalked. I managed to get home, but it was nerve-wracking. I didn't know if he just happened to be going the same way or if he was truly following me. At first, I didn't want to rely solely on my coworkers' suspicions. They weren't detectives, after all, but I gave the man the benefit of the doubt. However, my thoughts changed when I went to work the following night. The creepy man was back, and at one point I noticed that he was standing uncomfortably close to the bathroom. Then, during my break, I went to a nearby convenience store and realized that he was following me again. He watched me enter the store and, to my surprise, left shortly after. Feeling relieved to be away from him, I returned to the restaurant. But there he was again, sitting on the seats opposite my work, never taking his eyes off me. I asked my coworkers and manager to keep an eye on him over the coming days because I still wasn't sure what to do. Chillingly, I later heard from a colleague that the stalker had been seen going into the same convenience store right after I left and had bought the exact same things as me. Apparently, he was even interested in the magazines that I had picked up and flipped through. It was all piling up on me. It felt like he was there from the moment that I started my shift until the moment I finished, but I didn't know what I could accuse him of or how much trouble it might cause me if I did and wasn't taken seriously. At that point, I was so creeped out that I began to dread going to the job that I had once enjoyed, and I was feeling frightened. My manager must have noticed how anxious I was because he filed a complaint with the security guard, and the security guard approached the creepy guy asking, "Excuse me, can you explain what you're doing?" It wasn't aggressive, but it worked. The man, visibly embarrassed, quickly walked away, but my relief was short-lived. The very next day, the man was back, watching me and following me again. This time, my manager was furious. He stormed over to the security guard and demanded that he give the man a strong warning, and he was not to return, and if he did, he would file a police report. The security guard did just that. Once again, the man got up and left, clearly embarrassed. I hope the threat of a police report had done the trick, and for the first time in a while I had a peaceful shift, and it felt so good to glance at the seats and see them empty. When my shift ended that night, I headed to the parking lot to get my bicycle. It was always dark down there, especially after a late shift. As I unlocked my bike and tried to push off, it wouldn't move. Confused, I looked back to see if my wheel was caught on something, and that's when I saw him. My stalker was standing there, gripping my back tire tightly with both hands, preventing me from leaving. It was terrifying. He seemed to have stepped out of the shadows, and I hadn't even realized that he was in the parking lot with me. I was so scared that I couldn't make a sound. I tried to push off again, but weaker this time, knowing it wouldn't work. And then I heard him muttering something. Why? And something inside me shifted at that moment. My fear turned to anger in an instant, and I spun around and yelled at him, "What do you think you're doing? Let go of my bike." I didn't expect his response. Why? Why did you say you were going to the police? What on earth were you thinking?" His words creeped me out even more, highlighting how self-centered and delusional he was. It was all about him, with no concern for how his actions had affected me. I shouted back, "I'm scared. You creep me out. Let go of my bike." I hoped to embarrass him again because it seemed to work before, but he shouted back louder, "I never put my hands on you. Are you kidding me? You're going to call the cops just because I looked at you? Good luck." His selfishness was appalling. He didn't care how his actions were affecting me. It was all about him. Thankfully, our shouting had drawn the attention of mall security, who rushed over. As soon as the creep saw them, he bolted, running off with his tail between his legs. After that encounter, my boss insisted on police patrols to ensure that if the man showed up again, he would be met by the authorities. Even with the cops around, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might show up at any moment. I grew paranoid, feeling anxious whenever anyone so much as glanced my way for more than a few seconds. In the end, I had to leave that job. I got into a university hundreds of miles away, and honestly, I'm glad I left. Before that creep came along, it had been the best job I ever had, even though some shifts were long and late. What I still have trouble getting over, though, all these years later, is the fact that he was angry at me for wanting to report his behavior. He was a glimpse into a solipsistic world, a man with no ethics. He said this to a 17-year-old girl who was scared and tired of being stalked by him. "I never put my hands on you. Are you kidding me? You're going to call the cops just because I looked at you?" He knew what he was doing. He knew to leave when security came, and he knew to hide when the police arrived, and he knew how to gaslight and manipulate me into thinking that I'd be in the wrong for reporting him. All I can say is that I'm very grateful for the people who have helped me through that situation. If it weren't for them, who knows what could have happened. This happened when I was in the second grade. I felt sick in the morning but wanted to go to school that day. I managed the first period okay, but then I was sent home because I was running a high fever. Luckily, we lived on the same street as the school, so instead of getting my parents out of work to come and pick me up, I just walked home. It was fine to walk home alone for me. I didn't ever worry. It was only a short walk. I let myself in and went straight to my bedroom. I got into bed and fell asleep before I knew it, and I was sleeping soundly, I guess, but then I was awoken by a noise from downstairs. I honestly just thought that it was my mom coming back from her part-time job or from shopping or something, and the school probably called her. Since she woke me up, I figured that I might as well go downstairs to go and see her. I crept down the stairs quietly. I felt like surprising her that day. I likely had a smile on my face as I slowly went downstairs. However, that smile would have soon disappeared when I realized that Mom wasn't down there. Someone else was. It was our neighbor, a guy of about 50 years old, and he lived next door. I stopped and stared at him, and he had a knife in his hand. Seeing me at home, he panicked. And now I'm old enough to know that he didn't expect company. He would have assumed that the house would have been empty, or, I dread to think, my mom would have been home alone. Before I could begin to process what I was seeing and begin to question what was happening, he spoke to me. "Hey, can you keep a secret? No one needs to know that I was here. Okay, pal?" My eyes were glued to the knife in his hand the whole time he was speaking. My brain was now in gear. Remember, I had just woken up and I had a fever, and now I was beginning to put two and two together. Well, trying as best as I could. I was only a kid when this happened. I stared at that knife and I just thought to myself, I am in danger. I was so scared when the gravity of the situation set in that all I could do was nod yes. He smiled at me when I nodded, and then to my surprise, he turned and left. I ran over to the door and locked it. I guess I must have forgotten to lock it when I got in from school. I wanted to tell my parents, but I thought that my neighbor might kill me if I told them. He had scared me so much with that knife that he had in his hand that there was no way that I could break the promise that I had with him. I had to keep that secret. And so, I didn't say anything to my parents. About a month went by and life was kind of back to normal. I thought about the neighbor often, and I didn't like being home alone after school waiting for my parents to come home, but I was surviving. And one afternoon after school, I heard a knock at the door. I went to the door and it was the old man next door, standing out there. He had a load of sweets and he wanted to give them to me. I was so stupid to open the door while I was home alone after what had happened. I realize now how foolish I was to open the door while I was home alone after what had happened, and I know better now. Reluctantly, I accepted what he offered and quickly closed the door. After that, he would bump into me or come to the house once a month, always bringing candy, and he would smile and say, "Here you go, eat these." At the time, I didn't understand why he kept giving me sweets. In hindsight, I guess it was to bribe me into silence. I can't be certain, but that's what it seems like. I didn't like being rewarded for reasons I didn't understand. It felt wrong and a bit disturbing. Whenever I saw him smiling at me with his candy in his hand, I couldn't help but picture him holding a knife instead. One time he came over with candy while my mom was home. I didn't want to talk to him or make eye contact, so my mom made excuses for me, saying things like, "Oh, he's just shy." She even laughed, finding my shyness endearing, I guess, but she didn't know the secret that I was keeping for him. Months went by, and then I heard the news that our creepy old neighbor had passed away, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. My parents thought that I would be devastated because to them, it seemed like we had some sort of deep connection, but instead, I was celebrating, not mourning. I didn't shed a tear for that man. Life moved on. I grew up, moved away, and started a life on my own. I've always been a little on edge when home alone, but it has gotten easier over the years. Last weekend, I returned to my hometown and was reminded of our neighbor at a neighborhood party with my parents, and someone brought him up, and I listened in. "That old guy loved betting on horse races and playing the slots," someone mentioned. Another person added, "Yeah, I just remember him being an alcoholic. He used to show up at our house uninvited all the time. I had to have strong words with him once to make him leave. And then another chimed in, "Isn't it funny how all the thefts in the neighborhood stopped after he passed away?" And that's when it dawned on me that he was probably there that day to rob us, maybe even more. If my mother had been home alone, something that happened often because she worked part-time, things could have turned out very differently. He must have been bribing me with sweets to keep his secret. He was an alcoholic thief who preyed on our neighborhood. I can still see his face and the knife in his hand. It's a memory that haunts me to this day. This happened about 5 years ago in Kyoto, the former capital of Japan. I had an office job and sometimes the hours weren't as flexible as I'd like them to be. We workers usually had to stay until the projects we were responsible for were complete. I didn't mind, I suppose, but it was hard to maintain any constants in my life. Because I didn't have a steady routine, I decided to do something about it. I made a commitment to myself. I would take a walk after work around a forest trail near my neighborhood, no matter what time of day that I finished. Now, since I typically finished work late and the forest trail was quite remote, I usually didn't run into any people during my walks. But one night, that changed. I encountered someone standing by the side of the forest trail. He was a man of medium build, dressed in dark clothes, and the most striking thing about him was that he was completely still. And in a word, he was motionless. And from the moment I saw him, I felt something was off. He gave me the creeps, and I didn't like the idea of passing him in the middle of the forest, in the dark. I didn't want to go anywhere near him, but if I turned back, it would add another 30 minutes to my walk. I didn't want to do that. I remember physically trying to stop my hands from shaking. I was all tensed up, sure that he was about to do something as I passed him by, but fortunately he didn't. It was as if he didn't even notice me. Due to some terrible weather in the area, I hadn't been out for my walk for a few days. I also skipped my routine walks on the weekend. When I finally got back on the trail, to my shock, I encountered the same man again, standing in the exact same spot as before, 4 days after our first meeting. It was an unusually clear night. The full moon illuminated the forest trails well, and thanks to the moonlight, I was able to see the man from a distance and turn back quietly before he noticed me. Once again, he was motionless with a vacant look on his face. Why was he out there? And because of him, I quit my nightly walks. I just didn't feel like doing them anymore. About 2 weeks later, I was in the office break room reading the newspaper when I got another shock. An article reported that a body had been found in the forest and the police suspected murder. I immediately thought of that strange man and wondered, could he be behind it? It seemed possible, but in the end, I thought it was probably unlikely. Still, I couldn't get it out of my mind. My curiosity got the better of me, so one Sunday morning I headed back to the trail. I found the area the police had cordoned off, and there was police tape and a detour in place. The spot covered by a white tarp, hidden from the public, was exactly where I had seen that man standing by the trail. When I saw that, I got the shivers and immediately turned back for home. It might not be related, but after that, something strange happened. I developed insomnia and couldn't sleep without taking sleeping pills. I think I might have had a close call that night I passed by that man, and could he have been the culprit? Or had I passed by the victim who was somehow trying to be found? Or maybe it was neither, and I guess I'll never know. My parents divorced when I was in kindergarten. It was a rough patch in my life, but I won't bore you with the details. To skip ahead, I ended up living with my dad when I was in elementary school. We lived in an apartment. My dad wasn't rich and neither was his family, but I wouldn't say that we were poor either. I felt like I had a normal lifestyle. This happened when I was in the 6th grade, so around 11 years old. After school, I had volleyball practice, and afterwards I usually walked home. I'm a girl, by the way, and usually a friend walked home with me, but That day she was out sick, so I had to walk alone. I left school at around 5 p.m., which was later than usual for me. Since it was winter, it was already dark. The walk from school to our apartment was about 25 minutes, and because we lived in a rural area, there weren't many streetlights. I was scared of walking home alone at that age, so I tried to go as fast as I could. Even though I was tired from practice, I felt like I was keeping a decent pace, and about 5 minutes into my walk, I noticed a man in his 30s walking behind me. Normally, it wouldn't have felt like a big deal if it were daytime, but since it was dark and I was alone, I was very nervous, and my heart was starting to pound. What if I get abducted? Like on the news, I wondered. Feeling paranoid, I quickened my pace. I didn't know if it was my imagination, but it seemed like when I sped up, so did he. In my rural town, you didn't see many people out after dark. Most people were at home relaxing by then, and that's how I saw it, at least. I kept thinking if something happened to me, no one would be around to help or even notice. And the more I allowed these frightening thoughts to enter my mind, the faster I walked. I was almost home when I reached a red light at the intersection across from my street. I used the opportunity to check behind me. The man who I thought had been following me wasn't there anymore, and I felt relieved and assumed that I'd been overthinking. I slowed down to my usual walking speed. I crossed the road and turned toward our apartment, but when I looked back one last time, the man was there again, and the sight of him gave me goosebumps. Freaked out, I broke into a sprint. I ran upstairs to our apartment, scrambled to get my keys out of my bag, and quickly unlocked the door before rushing inside. We lived on the second floor. I went straight to the bedroom and cautiously opened the curtains a little to look outside, and the man was standing on the street staring up at me. I was terrified and couldn't bring myself to look away. I just stood there, watching him until he slowly walked away from our building. About 2 hours after the man left, my dad came home from work. I desperately wanted to tell him what had happened, but I didn't want to worry him. He always seemed stressed, so I just kept quiet. A month passed, and I thought about that day often, but nothing else happened to make me feel scared or anxious. Then, about 2 months after that incident, on a Sunday morning at around 8 a.m., someone rang our buzzer. My dad was getting ready for work, so I went to the door and looked through the peephole. 2 men in suits were standing outside. I called out and asked who they were. One of the men said that they were from City Hall, so naturally I opened the door. And as soon as I did, one of the men stuck his foot in the doorway to prevent me from closing it, and I was terrified. "We're here to have a difficult conversation with your father," one of the men said. "Is he here?" I didn't know what else to do, so I called my dad. When he came to the door, it seemed like he recognized the 2 men, and he turned to me and said, "Go wait in the kitchen." My dad's mood shifted drastically after seeing them. I wanted to know who they were and why they needed to talk to him, so I lingered in the hallway listening. I didn't make it to the kitchen, and my dad must have noticed because he suggested to the men, "Gentlemen, shall we talk outside?" They stepped outside and my dad followed, shutting the door behind him. They talked for about an hour and I couldn't hear anything. When my dad finally came back in, he was quiet, and I asked him about the men. "Were those guys from City Hall?" I asked. "It's not a big deal. Everything is fine," he said, and that was the end of the conversation. He didn't want to discuss it any further. 3 days later, I woke up for school as usual. I expected to see my dad rushing around getting ready for work, but the apartment was unusually quiet. I called out for him, but there was no reply, and I assumed that he had already left for work, so I didn't think much of it and headed to school. That evening, I came home and waited for my dad to return. An hour passed, and then 2, and then 3, but he still wasn't home. By 9 p.m., I was looking through the fridge for dinner, and after a poor excuse of a meal, I went to bed, hoping everything would be back to normal in the morning. But when I woke up, I already knew, before I even got out of bed, that my dad still wasn't home. The apartment felt too quiet, and I remember it was Saturday and there was no school. I usually like to sleep in on the weekends, but I couldn't rest very easy, not knowing where my dad was. At around 7 a.m., I got a call from my aunt, my father's brother's wife. "Are you okay? I'm coming to pick you up now," she said. About 30 minutes later, she arrived and rang the buzzer, and she told me to pack some clothes and things I needed for school, and confused, I did as she asked. After I packed, she told me that I'd be staying at her place for the night, and we got in the car and drove to her house. When we arrived, I saw my uncle sitting with a glass of whiskey, looking very serious. He was bald, and if my dad ever lost all of his hair, they'd look nearly identical. He didn't mince words. He simply said, "You'll be staying here from now on. Sorry, but your dad's not coming home anymore. You have to go to school from here." Tearful and upset, I kept asking why, and finally he said, "It looks like your dad was in a lot of debt." As the days, weeks, and months passed, I pieced together what had happened. My dad had either left me in the middle of the night or had been taken away by debt collectors. I'm sure the man who followed me home that day was a debt collector, and those two men who came to the door pretending to be from City Hall were debt collectors too. And that all happened a long time ago. I haven't seen my dad in 15 years. I feel a lot of different emotions about everything, and I'm not always sure how to express them. I've heard a rumor that my dad is now disabled and living in an institution, but it's just a rumor. Even if I knew where to find him, I'm not sure if I would. I usually read scary stories online, and I just wanted to share mine. My dad disappeared in the middle of the night when I was in elementary school, and even if I knew where to find him, I'm not sure if I would. I've had some pretty creepy experiences in my life, and many of them still live with me, re-emerging when the lights go out. And by that, I mean I am essentially haunted by their memory. One experience in particular stands out. I remember being home alone and hearing a woman's voice. I couldn't make out what she was saying. She was mumbling and sobbing. It was terrifying, and I just ran straight out of the house. On another occasion, I was home alone and the door to the living room slowly creaked open by itself. I immediately got to my feet to see who was there, but of course, no one was. I don't know if I'm susceptible to paranormal stuff, but I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't a believer. But talking about the paranormal isn't why I'm here today. I want to share with you the scariest experience I've ever had, which happened when I moved into an apartment to live alone for the first time in my life. This happened 3 years ago, just after I had moved in. Picture a room with just the bare essentials, furniture, and a lot of cardboard boxes. I was too tired to unpack, so I thought that I'd do it the following morning, and after positioning my armchair at the perfect angle for the TV, I collapsed into it and relaxed. I must have dozed off because I was suddenly awakened by a strange noise. I heard laughter coming from the opposite side of the living room wall. I only heard it once, or at least I think I did, so I chalked it up to being half asleep. I didn't make a big deal out of it and got up and went to bed. The next morning, as I was making breakfast, I heard another noise from the wall opposite my living room, and it was that same laughter. A weird thought crossed my mind. Was the person next door laughing at me? I need to give you some context here, though. When you think of laughter, you probably imagine sitcom laughter, like a live audience laughing at something funny. But this laugh wasn't like that. It wasn't someone laughing at a TV show. It was deliberate and unsettling, like something out of a horror movie, almost like the Joker. It creeped me out. I hadn't introduced myself to my neighbors yet, and since it's customary in Japan to greet neighbors when you move in, I figured now was a good time. At least I knew the guy next door was home, judging by that laugh, and I was sure it was a man based on the sound. So I went outside and rang the doorbell. I waited a couple of moments, but no one answered. Just as I was about to give up and go back inside, one of the other neighbors came out of their apartment, and he looked like he was heading to work. "No one's lived there for a long time," he said. As you can imagine, that was strange to hear, considering I had just heard someone laughing next door. I introduced myself, but kept the laughter to myself, and I chalked it up to another paranormal encounter. Great, I thought. Trust me to live next to a haunted apartment. Normally I would have freaked out and wanted to move immediately, but since I had previous run-ins with ghosts, I decided to stick it out. Nothing much happened, except for hearing that strange laughter now and then over the following days. Who cares about a little laughter, though, anyway, you're probably telling yourself. Well, 3 months went by quickly, and aside from the occasional laughter, things were uneventful. And then, after that 3-month mark, I started hearing a new noise. It was a strange clanking sound coming from the living room wall. The laughter was one thing, but a clanking, banging sound was a bit too much. I thought about moving, but honestly, I was just too lazy to pack everything up and find a new place. I stalled and eventually learned to live with the noise. Life got in the way, and I was out more than I was in, anyway. One weekend, either a Saturday or Sunday, I got so annoyed by that noise that I decided to kick the wall where the sound was coming from. In my head, I thought it was pointless. Kicking the wall wouldn't bother a ghost. But I kicked it anyway, and I wasn't prepared for what happened next. I heard a distinct male voice shouting, "Whoa!" followed by the sound of something crashing. What the hell is going on, I thought. I froze. I didn't expect to provoke a reaction from a ghost. Then, reality hit me. Occam's razor. There wasn't a ghost next door. Maybe someone had been living there without the landlord's knowledge, possibly squatting. I wasn't about to ring the doorbell again, but I knew someone who would. The police. I called the cops and they arrived quickly. I heard them try the door and go inside. There was a commotion, a heated exchange, and some screaming. It turned out that someone had been living next door, and I found out later that a middle-aged man had been staying there, even though the apartment was supposed to be empty. Apparently, the man was under the influence of illicit substances, and when the police busted in, he went on a rampage, kicking and screaming. It turned out that he was the landlord's son. His father had allowed him to use the apartment to do whatever he did in there because of his struggles with addiction. And I was furious. I had been paying rent while this guy came and went as he pleased, laughing like a maniac. That laugh creeped me out, but it wasn't nearly as terrifying as what I later realized the clanking sound was. That sound was him digging a kitchen knife into the drywall that separated our apartments. There were tons of holes on his side of the wall, and it seemed like he was trying to break through into my living room. And after that, I moved out. I got my deposit back and was forgiven a couple of weeks of rent, which, in my opinion, was the least they could do. Although I've had my run-ins with the paranormal, the fear that I feel when I remember that man slashing at the wall is unmatched, and I dread to think what his messed up meth head plan was. When I was house hunting, I was looking for a place that was cheap and didn't mind if it had a bit of an edge to it. A real estate company was eager to show me an apartment. It was a small place, but it had a loft and nice sun coverage. The coolest thing about the apartment was the vast amount of storage space due to the high ceilings, and it was in a great location. I literally had no complaints, so I told them that I'd take it on the spot. And man, was that a mistake. At the time, I had a cat, and I have to admit that I forgot to let them know. In my defense, they never asked, and I felt guilty about it, but I didn't want to lose the place or give up my cat. It was tough. I figured it might be best to just keep quiet and see if anyone noticed. After meeting some of the residents and introducing myself, I took a look around the area to familiarize myself and find my go-to stores. The neighbors were welcoming, and I liked them. Once all the moving was done, I was exhausted. That night, I only unpacked the bare essentials. My cat was acting strangely. She stayed by the front door and occasionally hissed, and I assumed it was due to the new environment, so I didn't think anything of it. But then my cat made a low, growling noise, the kind that you're probably familiar with. That unnerved me a bit because she didn't usually make that sound. I figured maybe that there was another cat nearby and tried to ignore it. I went to sleep quickly, exhausted from the move. But my cat wouldn't stop growling night after night. One evening, I tiptoed over to her, trying to figure out what was bothering her. I realized that there was someone on the other side of the door. I'm not talking about anything supernatural. I mean, a human. You know when you see the shadow of feet through the gap beneath the door? That's what I saw. I wanted to throw the door open and confront whoever was there, but the risks were too high, and I didn't feel safe. Whoever was out there was not normal. Who stands in front of someone's door in the middle of the night? I was terrified. I was living alone as a young woman, and someone was outside my door for reasons I couldn't understand. The only thing I could do was retreat to my bedroom with my cat and wait until morning. My cat kept growling, and I barely slept that night. And after that, sleeping became difficult. I wanted to move out of the apartment, but I was locked into a long-term lease and couldn't leave without losing a lot of money. I didn't have any family to turn to either. I had 3 months left before I could move, so I held on to that. The stress got to me, and I ended up visiting a doctor who told me that I was suffering from stress, and I even lost weight. I stayed with a friend for a few days, but after a while I felt like a burden, so I returned to my apartment. I decided to show my face more around the apartment complex, hoping to get along better with my neighbors and let them know that I was okay. But as I bumped into them and said hello, I was shocked that every single one of them, in one way or another, mentioned my cat or cats in general. Now here are a few examples. You know, cats aren't allowed in this building, right? That's crazy, isn't? Just a thought I should let you know. I would never dream of bringing a pet in here without the landlord's approval. I'm sure you feel the same. You know the landlord hates cats, right? I couldn't believe it at first. Did you know that? And I never took my cat out of the room. She was an indoor cat. How did they even know I had one? She wasn't causing any trouble. I was a proud cat owner and took good care of her. I was sick of these not-so-subtle comments, so when the next person asked me about it, I responded, "How did you know I had a cat?" I expected them to play dumb, but my neighbor's reply shocked me, because we all took turns watching. And this is where the story gets truly intense. Apparently the landlord had ordered the other residents to keep an eye on me. My neighbor told me that as soon as I returned home from work, someone was assigned to keep watch. The creepiest part was that she wasn't even embarrassed or thought it was strange. She proudly and smugly admitted that she found my cat by lifting the mail slot on my door to peek inside my apartment. I argued that what she did was a complete invasion of my privacy and totally insane. Every argument I made was met with the same response. We were just doing what the landlord told us. It was a total weird setup, and it was deeply disturbing. The landlord had brainwashed them all. Since my neighbor was happy to tell me everything, I just kept asking more questions, and her smug smile only grew wider as she saw how much it was affecting me. When she told me that the landlord had instructed them to go through my mail to learn more about me, I decided enough was enough. I called the real estate agency immediately and informed them that I was leaving, and thankfully they were sympathetic and I didn't lose any money. Now I understand why such a great place and a great location was so cheap. I can laugh about it now and it makes for a good story, but it is still deeply disturbing to me. Nowadays I live in a better place. No weirdos outside, no issues with pets, and no insane landlord. Sometimes a good place is worth the price, and if something seems too good to be true, it usually is.
Maybe it was just a coincidence, but it all started with a program I watched on TV. I had been watching it for about 2 years or so, I guess. So you could call me a fan. It wasn't a popular TV show. It had a minor following online, and each episode was only about 30 minutes long. It has since gone off the air, but one of the segments of the show would ask the viewers to send in creepy submissions. To be honest, I think that was the best part of the show, and I didn't love the other segments. Just to give you a flavor of what some of the submissions were like, I'll give you some examples. There was one where this guy sent in a video of his pet acting really strangely. That one was pretty scary. Another one was of someone filming a very odd billboard as they passed through some town in the middle of nowhere. I can't remember what was on the billboard exactly, but that one was really weird. If you submitted a video of something strange and mysterious, and your video was selected to be on the show, then you won a prize. Every time I watched that show, I would think to myself, I could come up with something that would make it on the show. The prize, whatever it was, didn't really matter to me. I just wanted to think up something cool to fit the theme. Then my idea came to me. Although I guess it wasn't the most entertaining idea, it was my idea, and I couldn't wait to get started on my creation. I immediately started preparations, and the more I did, the more I loved it. It was a fairly straightforward idea. I wanted to attach a noose to something like a tree limb and make a sign to go with it. That's all it was. I wanted my sign to read, "Feel free to use this." And I wanted to be able to stake it into the ground, so all I needed was some wood. After I made the sign, next was the rope. I had to look online for how to make a noose. I thought it was going to be difficult, but it was a little easier than I thought. "Hi, Jay here. Feel free to use this" is a common phrase that you might see outside of public restrooms and drinking fountains in parks. That should give you a little bit of an idea of the writer's intentions. Back to the story. Now my creation was ready. All I needed to do next was to find a place to take a photo or a video of it, and then I could make my submission. I had some annual leave left available, so I decided to take a day off and drive out to the woods. I drove for miles to get there, because I knew that there was a quiet and peaceful forest just on the outskirts of the city. I got out of the car at a random spot, and I carried my rope and my handmade sign with me, careful to make sure I wasn't seen by anyone. I knew these woods were very, very quiet though. I headed into the woods. I was walking through the forest, and as I got deeper in, I managed to find what I considered to be the perfect spot. I found a solid pine tree. It was pretty big, and it had thick branches. There was a really thick one that jutted out about 3 meters above ground level, which is close to 10 feet. Just in front of the tree, I stuck my "Please feel free to use this" sign into the ground. I made sure it was really deep. Thankfully, it had rained that day, so the ground was plenty moist. Next, I climbed the tree, which proved to be very difficult in those conditions. And then I shimmied over to the branch that I had selected, and I tied the noose. When all was complete, I climbed down from the tree and stood in admiration of my work. I was pretty satisfied. By now, I'm sure you get my idea. I wanted to take a short video of me stumbling across a noose hanging from a tree with a sign in front of it saying, "Please feel free to use this." I know it's not in good taste, but I was certain it would have been good enough to get on that TV show. I thought it was actually a really cool idea. However, when I went to take the video, something didn't seem quite right to me. It looked all a little too new, if you know what I mean. The "Please feel free to use this" sign that I had bought from a hardware store in the city stood out like a sore thumb. Also, the wood I used to make my stake and sign looked like it had just been picked out of a timber yard. It looked fake. And though it was, I wanted to make my video look real. One saving grace was the rope. That didn't look too bad, but this brand new sign, supposedly being discovered deep in the forest, would not do. I had to think of how I could make my video. I didn't want to go to all that effort and then not make a submission. I thought about it for a while, and then it came to me. Because it had been raining, and more rain was forecast, I figured that if I left my sign out there for a while, it might end up looking a little more authentic. You know, a little more weather-beaten or something like that. I figured the wood of the sign would get covered in dirt and leaves from the wind and rain, and that would create the desolate atmosphere that I was looking for. Of course, I was a little worried that some hiker or someone would find it and remove it, but I guess that was a risk I just had to take. If I wasn't living in an apartment block, I would have put my sign in my garden or something. I was worried that someone might get mad and destroy the sign. You know, some overcautious, easy to offend know-it-all. I didn't want the law to get involved either, because to me this was nothing but a light-hearted prank. I don't think that I had committed a crime. I mean, essentially it's just a piece of art, right? With all that in mind, I decided not to be that bothered by leaving it there. Who cares, was my final thought as I headed back to my car through the forest. The following couple of days became very busy for me, and before I knew it, I had completely forgotten about making my video and the sign and the noose out there in the woods. Exactly 1 month later, I remembered that my piece of art was still out there in the woods. I remembered while I was watching that TV show, the one I was supposed to be submitting my video to. I immediately got in my car and drove off to the forest to see if it was still there. During the month I had forgotten about it, there had been some typhoons passing through my prefecture. When I arrived back at the forest, I noticed that there had been a lot of growth. The weeds and brush were difficult to wade through, the grass was thick, and the forest floor was littered with broken tree branches and leaves. It made it tricky to find my creation, and I would be lying if I said I didn't get a little lost. It didn't help that it was getting dark out too. Not too dark though. I found it after a while, but the second I laid eyes on my creation, I knew that I couldn't capture it on film. As I had hoped for, the atmosphere surrounding the tree looked, in a word, desolate. My signboard, which, when I left it, was a brilliant white, had now greyed, and the letters had slightly run. One thing was the words, "Feel free." They stood out as their letters looked completely untouched by the elements, and that was pretty eerie to me, but not as eerie as what I saw, because someone had taken my prank very literally. The noose that hung from the tree now suspended a body a few feet off of the ground. I think it was a woman, as the hair was long. It was matted with leaves and slick with rainwater. I couldn't see her face, and I am very grateful for that. I didn't know what stage of decomposition the body was in, and I didn't want to. However, just based on how static the body hung, I could tell that there was no life there. Due to the wind, the body slowly swung side to side now and then, and the tree limb and the noose creaked and squeaked in the breeze. The body slowly twirled, and just at the point where it would have been side-on facing me, revealing the face of the victim, I ran for it, and I ran as fast as I could. I was so scared. I am still scared, by the way. I thought about calling the police, but it turned out I was too scared of doing that too. If I reported it to the police, then what would happen to me? They would find out that I was the one who set it up. They might even stupidly think that I encouraged people somehow. I have wondered if what I did can be considered an assisted suicide. I don't think it should be. I don't think I should be accused of a crime when all I did was make a sign. I guess at the very worst, it could be seen as a mean-spirited prank and nothing more than that. But the thought that I could be accused of goading her into making her final decision, if I could be seen as encouraging her, that scares me the most, because that wasn't my intention, and that could get me in a lot of trouble. This all happened 2 years ago, and I still haven't reported it. I can't report it. I could get into so much trouble. It plays on my mind so often though, not because I feel some tremendous sense of guilt or anything, but because it could be the end of me. I keep an eye on the newspapers and the local news for any discoveries out there in those woods, but so far, there's been nothing. That's pretty frightening for me too, because for all I know, that body, that poor woman, may still be undiscovered, still squeaking and creaking in the breeze.
This happened when I was in the 3rd grade of elementary school. I think it wasn't long after I had turned 8 years old. My family and I were all out on a drive one weekend afternoon, and it was bright and a sunny day. I remember we were going to see our cousins, and I was really looking forward to it. We didn't end up making it to our destination that day. We got into a car crash, a really bad one. An oncoming car in the opposite lane had swerved over the central line and came into our lane. The car hit us head on and our car was smashed backwards into the border at the side of the road. We were out in the sticks, in the mountains, and we were hit with such force that we crashed beyond the guardrail and we ended up rear-ending the rocky outcrops of a mountain that we were passing under. I looked up to see that my mother, who was driving, was slumped forward in her chair. Her arms hung motionlessly at her sides. She was still in her chair, though. My grandma was in the back, and when we finally came to a stop, she had her head against the back of the driver's seat, and she wasn't moving. My grandma was in the back, and when we finally came to a stop, her head was pressed against the back of the driver's seat, and she wasn't moving. My sister was also in the car, lying face down in the footwell of the back seats. She was in an awkward position and wasn't moving either. As for me, I had insisted on riding shotgun, so I was in the passenger seat. The first thing I felt was pain in my leg. It felt like my leg was stuck at a weird angle and I couldn't move. I looked forward towards the front of the car and the hood was completely destroyed. Black smoke billowed out from the crumpled metal, and the windshield was smashed and the cracks in the glass made it look like the biggest spiderweb I had ever seen at that age. There was blood inside the car, a lot of it. I could see it, smell it, and it felt as if I could almost taste it. I wasn't sure if I was bleeding at that point. As I mentioned before, we crashed on a mountain road. Numerous cars were passing by since it wasn't exactly a quiet road. It wasn't the kind of road with a sidewalk either. There was nowhere for people to walk alongside it. There weren't even houses in the area, it was just a stretch of highway. Cars kept passing by and I didn't know what to do other than call out for help. I was panicking, as you can probably imagine, because I seemed to be the only one in the car who was conscious. Fear consumed me in those moments. I don't think I was even shouting words, I was just making as much noise as possible in the hope that someone would hear. I was so scared, but even though I was utterly terrified, there was one thing about that day that scared me even more. The scariest thing of all was the fact that no one pulled over to see if we were okay. No one stopped. I can't forget the faces I saw through the blood-stained, shattered glass. They just stared. I know some of them must have heard me screaming because they slowed down and rolled their windows down. The people passing along the highway just looked our way with half-hearted interest or morbid curiosity. Why didn't they stop to see if we were okay? And I still can't understand that. They didn't care. They just left us there while the smoke grew blacker and blacker, and I felt salty tears stinging the corners of my eyes. I felt so helpless. In the car, no one showed any signs of waking up, and I couldn't move. My leg had hurt at first, but now it was numb, and I felt utterly helpless. After about 15 minutes passed, or at least that's my best estimate, it could have been longer, my voice was getting hoarse from all the screaming and shouting. More cars passed, and still no one stopped. And I was beyond scared. I was, I guess, hopeless. But then I heard someone shouting and coming towards our car. Miraculously, two guys, who I can only assume were out on a hike in the nearby mountain area, came rushing over. Those middle-aged hikers were like guardian angels that day. They called for an ambulance and waited with us. Although my mother was bleeding profusely, her wounds weren't life-threatening and she needed stitches, though. My sister got away with just a couple of stitches, but she was badly bruised and had lots of minor cuts. And I thought I was going to lose my leg, but it wasn't that bad. It was just fractured. Unfortunately, my grandma didn't make it. She had suffered a collapsed skull as a result of the crash. The car that crashed into us belonged to an elderly couple, and I still remember what the old man looked like. He had a really red face. It looked like he'd been drinking or something, and I saw him at the hospital that we all ended up at. He nodded at us when I saw him and said something like, "Oh, you guys made it. I guess that means you're all good. That's great." Just like the passers-by on the highway, his interest in the damage that he caused was minimal. I learned something horrible about people that day. Indifference in Japan can be truly chilling. This happened when I was in elementary school, but I'll never forget it. I grew up on the outskirts of Tokyo in the suburbs. It wasn't the nicest of places, it was in an apartment block, but I guess it was what we could afford at the time. The building was old and a little unsafe, but it was home. In fact, the first floor was a restaurant, a Chinese place, and it didn't have a good reputation. I heard the adults in and around my family speaking about that place from time to time, and they never had anything nice to say about it. They said it was dirty, and to be honest, it did look dirty. That wasn't the problem, though. The restaurant owner's son was the problem. We were about the same age, we were both in elementary school, and he didn't go to my school, and I'm not even sure that he went to school, come to think of it. I never saw him wearing any school uniforms, and he seemed to be wearing the same tattered t-shirt and bottoms that I saw him in each day. I saw him pick on kids in the area as well, some kids who had learning challenges, and that really didn't sit right with me. And I also saw him chasing a cat around with a stick trying to club it. I just had the lowest opinion of that kid from the very beginning. And I'll go further. To be honest, I hated him, and he made me very uncomfortable. And if you don't hate him by now, let me share something extra. You see, one afternoon after school, I was playing with a couple of friends near our building, and there were 4 of us. Suddenly, the restaurant kid wanders over with his stick. I don't realize that he's coming at the time. I knew that he was there when I felt my skirt being lifted. I spun around in shock, and my friends gasped. I came face to face with that restaurant kid. I shouted at him. I said something like, "What do you think you're doing?" He looked me in the eyes, not ashamed that he had been caught doing something he shouldn't have. There was no annoyance, and instead, he was irritated. He was annoyed at how I had reacted, and he made this kind of ch noise. You know, the one that sounds like a tut. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I just kicked my right foot back at him as hard as I could, and he fell to the ground with a thud and groaned in pain. He looked up at me, and I expected him to lash out, but instead, he grinned. And man, was that grin scary. I knew at that moment that I had to avoid that kid at all costs. When I was out playing with my friends, if I ever saw that restaurant kid, I would do my best to steer clear of him. We even started hanging out in areas far from my home just on the off chance that we would run into him. But then he began showing up in other places. He always seemed to find my little group, and of course, whenever we saw him, we just scattered like pigeons. We didn't want to be anywhere near him. And sometimes he would sneak up on us without us knowing, try to mess with us, usually when we were at the park. Every kid wanted to be in the park during the summer, and even if he was there, I didn't want him to ruin it for me and my friends. And after a while, he kind of backed off and seemed content to do his own thing, so we stopped avoiding the park. He didn't bother us, and we didn't bother him. We used to love playing on that slide, and it wasn't just any slide. It was a huge one with tunnels where you could pick up quite a bit of speed, and the whole thing was shaped like a whale, and we thought that it was absolutely great. Now one day as we arrived and climbed the stairs to the slide, we noticed 4 bottles of juice at the top, and there was a note under the bottles written on a torn piece of paper, and it read, "Free, please take," in very bad handwriting. One of my friends started yelling and celebrating stuff, saying things like, "Wow, we got something for free." But I was more cautious. I told them to be careful. My parents had always warned me not to pick up things off the streets, and this felt like one of those situations, so I wanted no part of it. One of my friends, Alice, had said something like, "What are you worried about? It's for us." And she picked up a bottle of juice. 2 of my other friends joined her, and suddenly I felt like a stick in the mud for not joining in. They each grabbed a bottle and called out, "Are you sure you don't want any?" Alice looked at me, and she was annoyed that I wasn't going to join in as she unscrewed the cap of her bottle. She was the first to start drinking the juice, throwing her head back and gulping it down. She managed about 3 gulps before it happened. She leaned forward and started spitting out the juice, or rather, throwing it up. She was projectile vomiting like something out of The Exorcist, and then she started coughing heavily, and we all laughed it off, saying, "That's what you get for chugging it." But there was one problem. She didn't stop coughing. We all stared at her, collectively thinking, "That's a lot of coughing. When's it going to end?" Then I broke the silence and asked, "Are you okay?" And she didn't respond. She kept coughing and spluttering. It was no longer funny. She was spitting, and when I saw her spit hit the ground, it looked brown. I looked at her and saw that foamy brown spittle was trailing from the corners of her mouth, and something was very wrong. We started screaming, and panic hit us like a wave, and we were all shouting for Alice's attention, each of us wanting her to say that she was fine. Alice looked up at us, clutching her chest, and the last thing we heard her say was, "Hot, hot, Mom," as she thrashed around. An older woman who had seen us crying and wailing rushed over and asked what had happened. The only thing we could tell her was that Alice drank the juice that we found at the top of the slide, and as we panicked and explained, we saw a look of horror across the woman's face. She dug out a flip phone from her purse and called for an ambulance. Us young girls couldn't do anything but freak out. Yet, amidst all this chaos, I felt like I needed to turn away from Alice, as if someone was watching me. I turned to meet the eyes of the restaurant kid. He was crouching behind some plants in the park. It was summer and the grass was higher than usual. The restaurant kid was squatting down, watching our panic, smiling, so pleased with himself. My other two friends, and of course not Alice, didn't notice him, but I sure did. And as soon as he realized that I had spotted him, he ran. Moments later, the ambulance arrived for Alice. My parents and the paramedics asked me very serious questions, but I couldn't answer. It was all just some blur. I was so scared for my friend. I thought that when she left in that ambulance, it might be the last time that I ever saw her. Fortunately, it wasn't. She made a recovery and was even back at school after a week or two. And later we found out that the juice that she drank wasn't just juice. It had been laced with pesticides. No one knew who would put those bottles on the slide. I heard words like random and no motive thrown around a lot. In the end, they never caught the person who left the pesticide-laced juice on the slide, but I knew who did it. I just couldn't prove it. I was a kid and didn't know what I could do about it. I was just really glad Alice was back at school and safe. I guess I was also a little scared to come forward with my theory about who did it. I was afraid that if I told anyone, he would try to hurt me or my friends again. We all got a lecture about not touching things that aren't ours or accepting gifts from strangers. And a few months later, the restaurant on the bottom floor of our building went out of business or moved, I don't know which. It became a convenience store. I think no one missed that restaurant or that family, to be honest. I have no idea where that kid went. I just know that he probably didn't stop there. And he might be out there doing worse things than poisoning little girls at the park.